Right, so for some of you, you won't even know that I disappeared. For me, I've literally gone back to back. All the collar discs are all still over my mouse mat and in the way. But let's go straight in with a reenacting video, because keep getting emailed. When are you going to do more? When are you going to do more? Obviously, in emails, they don't sound like that, but in my head, that's what I hear. So, this guy you may recognize, and he sent me a message, or it was through eBay, or through, not eBay, Facebook, or through something. And I said, I love your video style, it's brilliant. And he said, I'll be doing more. And he said, he mentioned this one. I said, right, I'll stick that on my list. So I will get to the video links that you guys have sent in shortly. But I want to do this one first because I really like this guy's style and his presentation and the way he comes across. And his microphone obviously works a damn sight better than mine, so apologies for that. So let's hit play and see what he says. This is five myths about the US Army in World War II that just won't die. Now, every reenactor probably can come up with a lot more than 5 straight off the top of your head. Really dumb stuff that you hear other reenactors going, oh yes, that's why they did that. They all did that, and this is why. Just utter garbage. So yeah, what 5 is he going to come up with?
Please make it stop. I seem to hear the same few World War II myths repeated everywhere I go, and
yeah, there we go. And it really is as well. It's so true. It's the same things you hear over and over.
Since clearly I can't run from them any longer, it's time I face them head on. Today, we'll focus on 5 myths about the US Army in World War II, and if you have any interest in history, I can almost guarantee you've encountered some of these myths before. So fix bayonets and change out those skivvies, because today we're going on the offensive to put these myths to rest once and for all. Let's get right into it with the first myth. Myth number 1. The US Army didn't fight in the Pacific. When most people picture US troops fighting in the Pacific during World War II,
yeah, no, the Army was there. There's quite a few units of the Army in the Pacific. Even some of the airborne lot were out there. Oh, I don't know who's come up with that one. I haven't actually heard that. He's right though. You do instantly think the Marines were in the Pacific, the Army were in Europe. Where the Army were also in the Pacific, but the Marines were in Europe.
They picture Marines. Yeah. After all, the Marines handled the Pacific while the Army was busy fighting in Europe and North Africa, right?
Yeah.
Wrong.
Well, no, it is right, but the Army were also somewhere else.
Maximum strength, the Marines fielded 6 divisions in the Pacific and Asia, amounting to somewhere around 250,000 Marines. The Army, on the other hand, fielded 22 divisions in that same region, plus additional combat groups, all of which added up to almost 2 million soldiers in theater. So not only was the Army present in the Pacific, but they vastly outnumbered the Marines, making the Army the primary US land fighting force in the Pacific theater. Throughout the war in the Pacific, Army logistical troops worked hard to supply not only the enormous number of US soldiers in theater, but also the Marine Corps, who relied almost entirely on the Army and Navy for logistical support. Army ground troops were landing on island after island and engaging in brutal fighting with the enemy. Army medical personnel were operating the majority of the field hospitals. The US Army Air Forces were
it makes sense.
Pouring it on the Japanese from above. Army leadership was dictating the strategy of the war. I could keep going on, but you get my point. Now, my intention here is in no way to discredit the contributions of the brave Marines who served in the Pacific during World War II. In fact, it's my opinion that the efforts of both the Army and the Marines are often underrepresented and not given the spotlight they deserve. Okay, so if the Army had more...
I also love that I'm not the only one to drink out of one of these during videos.
More troops in the Pacific than the Marines and did more of the fighting, why do so many people associate the Devil Dogs with the Pacific theater? Well, I think there are 4 main reasons for this. First, the Marines had better PR than the Army. Even during the war, many of the headlines about the Pacific focused on the Marines. The Marines had built up...
I think it's very easy, isn't it? It's too easy to go, the Army's over there, the Marines are over there. Rather than the Army's over there, the Army and the Marines are doing that bit. It's just, and also the term Marine, it sounds a bit more exciting than the Army. A Marine, it sounds like these super soldiers, you know, it just sounds, it's an easier sell, it really is.
up a reputation for being this elite outfit of fighters, and stories of this relatively small group of elite US troops hammering the Japanese made for great reading on the home front. History News Network has a great article about the US Army in the Pacific, and it includes some quotes from US Army soldiers about the media frenzy surrounding the Marines at the time. US Army Major General Oscar Griswold is quoted as saying, "Out here, mention is seldom seen of the achievements of the Army ground troops, whereas the Marines are blown up to the skies."
Yep.
There was even one junior
As I said, it's a much easier PR sell.
officer in the US Army who wrote this in a letter to his family. "The Marines are so hopped up with their publicity. Someone has to fight them, and I'm the guy. Our men are getting awfully tired of reading about the exploits of the Marines out here. We have been able on many occasions to identify pictures of Marines in action as being pictures of Army troops. The standing joke now is that the Marines' secret weapon is the Army. Second, the Marines led the charge in many of the most famous battles, taking very high casualties in the process. The Marines didn't get all this focus on them for nothing. While it's true that the Army did more of the overall fighting in the Pacific, the Marines spearheaded many of the most well-known landings. US Marines landed in the first waves at Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and more. Obviously, that was incredibly dangerous, and this led to the Marines having a much higher casualty rate than the US Army overall. These large-scale operations naturally made lots of headlines, and even though the Army was involved in all of those operations, the focus was often put on the Marines who led the charge. Third, the Pacific was the Marines' primary focus during the war, while the Army was also fighting in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. There were exceptions, but the Marines were almost exclusively involved in fighting the Japanese during the war, while the Army was also fighting Germany and Italy. Given what we've covered about how much the public heard about the Marines fighting in the Pacific, it makes sense that many people started to associate the Marines with fighting the Japanese and the Army with fighting the other Axis countries. And fourth, Hollywood loves the Marines. I mean, who could blame them? The Marines are badass and they fought in a lot of high-profile battles. But there's been way more media produced over the years about the Marines fighting in the Pacific than the Army. Gung-Ho, Sands of Iwo Jima, the Pacific, Flags of Our Fathers, and Wind Talkers are just a few famous examples from the big screen. The US Army...
Well, you've got the pretty camouflage as well, which, you know, it does look good on camera. I mean, it is good-looking stuff. Whereas the Army... No. They don't.
And the Marines both contributed heavily to the fighting in the Pacific. So next time you hear someone repeat this myth that the Marines did it all, make sure to set them straight. This next myth is so popular that I often hear people talk about it like it's just common knowledge. Myth number 2, the US Sherman tanks sucked in comparison to the superior German tanks.
Now this is a thing we love winding Paddy up on from the old group. Panther's best tank in the war, Paddy. I don't know why you argue about that. Yeah, Shermans are rubbish. Everybody knows that. They're all called Ronsons. They brew up on one hit. Was it one strike lights every time or something? Yeah, and they only won because there was more of them. Everybody knows this. Come on.
People often imagine the M4 Sherman as this puny little tank that was far outclassed by German tanks and turned into a flaming death trap anytime you shot at it. And frankly, I won't stand for this Sherman tank slander any longer. Sure, the Sherman tank wasn't perfect, but it was one of the most effective and impactful tank designs in history. I think there are 3 main reasons why the Sherman tank is so widely discredited these days. I'm not planning to have a list of reasons for every myth, that's just how it's working out so far. First, many people only focus on early versions of the Sherman, which did have some issues. The biggest issue people tend to focus on is their reputation for catching fire when they were hit by the enemy. This was somewhat of a problem early on, but the military fixed it relatively quickly by moving the ammo racks and adding wet ammo stowage. Wet stowage refers to liquid-filled bladders that would help prevent fires if the ammo racks were hit. This didn't make it impossible for Shermans to catch fire, but it significantly reduced burn rates. Even before that change though, Shermans didn't really burn at a way higher rate than other tanks of the period like many people think. That problem certainly wasn't unique to the Sherman. Plus, a penetrating hit bad enough to set the ammo on fire likely would have put the tank out of action even if it didn't catch fire. Later versions of the Sherman also had thicker armor and other improvements that helped even more. Even among Shermans that did burn during the war, the crew members were often able to safely bail out before the flames consumed the tank. Especially with those changes made during the war, Sherman tanks weren't Tommy cookers like many people say, any more than German tanks were kraut roasters. Second, people put too much emphasis on tank versus tank comparisons.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, just like any other World War II nerd, I love looking at the stats of one tank in comparison to another because I find it interesting, but these comparisons are basically useless at determining how effective a tank was on the battlefield.
Yeah. There could be 50 of one type of tank and one of the other. So what these numbers, these statistics mean nothing. If it's 1v1 in a duel, then yeah, absolutely, those numbers mean everything. In the real world, yeah, not so much.
Despite what some people may imagine, tank strategy during World War II did not consist of each side sending their best tank to duel it out in the town square at high noon.
Yeah. Django! The real Django! Oh, this guy's my hero! Not Django, but the guy who's done the video, just for knowing who that is! I quote this so much, that awful bloody stupid modern film they did. Absolute garbage. This is the real Django the bastard, who dragged around a coffin, and at the end of the film, you realise why he drags around a coffin, because he's got a wooden Gatling gun in it. Yeah.
Tanks often worked hand in hand with the infantry to assault enemy positions, and even though, of course, tanks did encounter other tanks at times, enemy tanks only made up about 15% of the targets fired upon by US tanks during the war, according to a US Army report. The majority of targets were things like buildings, fortifications, enemy personnel, anti-tank guns, other vehicles, etc. In addition to the fact that it was somewhat rare for these tanks to actually be duking it out with one another, these comparisons are often super unrealistic and stacked against the Sherman. Oh, you're telling me the Sherman medium tank had thinner armor and a smaller gun than the German King Tiger heavy tank? Well, that must mean the Sherman was a terrible design. Sorry, I'm kind of laying the sarcasm on thick today, but that is a real conclusion I see people make from that comparison, and it's just nonsense. Many of the tanks that the Sherman is often directly compared to were not in the same class and were not frequently encountered by Shermans. For example, many people say there are only 3 verified cases of US troops encountering German Tiger 1s from Normandy through the end of the war. Those numbers are really hard to hammer down though, because US troops were really bad at identifying German tanks and would often report other German tanks as being Tigers. In any case, German heavy tanks like Tigers and even Panthers weren't all that
it's interesting, yeah, that inability to identify tanks correctly. There's rules in certain tabletop games. I think it might be Bolt Action that has, it's called something like Tiger Fear or something like that, where they just constantly identify all tanks as a Tiger. And yeah, so that sort of thing, that rumor or inability, not really a rumor because it's almost factual, that has carried across into quite a lot of other things as well.
Common on the battlefield, and comparing them directly to the Sherman in the ways that many people do is just silly. Medium tanks like the Sherman were built for mobility and support, not for tank duels. The German heavies were behemoths built around a completely different doctrine. Now that I think about it, maybe we should have designed some other type of vehicle designed specifically to destroy those German tanks. We could call it like a destroyer tank or something along those lines. Nah, that's a stupid idea. It makes a bit more sense to compare the Sherman to something a bit more common and similar, like the Panzer IV, but even then it's not...
I would say that is the closest comparison. There are so many T4s, or P4s, whatever you want to call them, that... I don't know where I was going with that. Yeah, I'm going to ignore that.
Not like those tanks were dueling all the time or something. And third, the Sherman's German counterparts have developed larger-than-life reputations. In addition to German heavy tanks not being super common on the battlefield, they often weren't that great. In fact, that's one of the reasons they weren't all that common on the battlefield. They often didn't even make it there due to mechanical failure. The Sherman was a great vehicle that was fairly reliable and easy to maintain. While the US was making simple, practical tanks that were effective on the battlefield, the Germans were busy trying to design the largest and most complicated tanks in history.
Yep.
And believe it or not, it didn't exactly pay off for them. People often share these sayings like, the Tiger was as good as 5 Shermans, but the Americans always had 6 of them. There's even an entire subreddit called r/Sherman Economy dedicated to tracking these wild comparisons of how many Shermans equal 1 German tank. Here in the real world, the later war variants of the Shermans with 76mm guns had plenty of power to knock out those big bad German tanks, and in many cases, even the 75mm guns were plenty to do the job depending on the circumstance. I even found one period report of a measly M8 Greyhound knocking out a German Tiger tank with its 37mm gun. Although, like I said, US troops were notoriously bad at identifying German tank models, so it could have been something else. These German tanks are often viewed as superior to Shermans today, but even a German Tiger tank with an 88mm gun didn't have the range to knock out US tanks from the ditch that it broke down in 10 miles behind the line. So no, the Sherman tank did not suck. It wasn't made to max out its dueling stats on paper. It was made to win the war. The Sherman was versatile, reliable,
He's not a top trumps card.
easy to produce and maintain, and just overall more effective than most of the German tanks that people put on a pedestal today. Real quick, if you guys are enjoying this, check right now to make sure you're subscribed to World War Wisdom so you don't miss more
guys, you got to subscribe to this guy. All of his videos are really good.
Videos like this. Okay, now let's keep cruising along with the next myth. Myth number 3. The US Army...
No. Yeah, they banned it in Europe because they kept getting killed by their own troops because they looked like Germans. Go on.
Banned camo uniforms because they were too similar to the German camouflage. According to this myth, the US Army issued out camo uniforms to some soldiers in Europe, but then had to stop using the uniforms entirely due to a high number of reported friendly fire incidents in which US troops shot their own comrades who were wearing camouflage because they thought they were Germans. To bust this myth, let's break it down into smaller pieces. First, did the Army issue camouflage uniforms in Europe? Yes, a test batch of frogskin camo fatigues were issued out to some US soldiers in the summer of 1944. These uniforms were mainly used by troops in the 2nd Armored Division, but they were also used by some troops in the 2nd and 30th Infantry Divisions. To be clear, these were not the same as the iconic camouflage uniforms worn by Marines in the Pacific. Okay, next, were US troops being mistaken for Germans because of these uniforms and shot by friendlies? No. We have no evidence that this ever happened to anyone.
Yeah, if this happened, you know how many reports there would have been on this? It would be documented everywhere. But it's just based on some silly rumours from probably only reenactors. Yeah, I don't know when this started, but yeah, I've always said it's utter bullshit.
Now, of course, with all the fighting that was going on, it's impossible for me to conclusively say that this never once happened, but there were never any reports of this, and it definitely didn't happen on a large scale like some people think. The YouTube channel World War II TV has a great video discussing this myth, and in their video, they mentioned that there were reports of friendly fire incidents caused by US uniforms that looked like German ones, but not the camo fatigues. Reportedly, there were friendly fire incidents in Normandy caused by the new solid-colored dark green fatigue uniform.
Oh, yeah. You can see it, can't you? Is it M44 German tunic? It looks... Yeah, I can see that.
And possibly the M43 field jacket as well. The darker color and longer cut of these uniforms made them look much more like the German uniforms than the previous M41 jacket, which was easily recognizable due to its light color and waist length. And finally, did the Army have to stop using these uniforms due to reports of friendly fire incidents? Absolutely not. Like we covered, not only were there no reports of friendly fire incidents caused by these uniforms, there were reported incidents caused by other uniforms, and they didn't pull those ones from service. So if it wasn't friendly fire that killed these camo uniforms, why did they stop using them? Well, the real answer is far less exciting. The uniforms faded and wore out quickly, they were more complicated and expensive to make than the solid color fatigues, but most importantly, the camo...
What a surprise, comes down to money, like most things in this hobby. Yeah, when you look at any changes to uniforms, it's always money.
camo pattern used on these uniforms just wasn't very effective, with some even saying it made soldiers more visible to the enemy. So why use it? Remember, these uniforms were only issued out in a small test batch to begin with, so when that batch of uniforms got wore out, those troops just went back to wearing standard uniforms. It wasn't that the army pulled these uniforms from the front, they just tested one batch of them and decided not to pursue issuing them on a wider scale. You can see.
Do you think how many pieces of kit, articles of uniform that were trialed like this? You know, you've got the ether cell canteens that, you know, tainted the water. They were shit, they didn't use them. The plastic halal tins, they cracked and then the bandage wasn't sterile, so that wasn't followed up with. Enamel canteens, one bash and the enamel comes off and the water goes rusty. There's so many things that they trialed. And there's also things that they trialed, because if you look closely at the boarding pictures of the 101st getting on the C-47's Greenham Column, I think it is, you can see one of them is wearing a 43 jacket. You can only see one guy in the picture that's wearing it. And again, he's trialing a 43 jacket whilst jumping into Normandy. So there's these odd little occasions where stuff like this happens. And I will say now, do not do an impression of that guy and say you're in Normandy trialing that. Jesus, can you imagine the outcry and the flack you're going to get? And rightfully so. This sort of trialing things happened all the time. This was just done on a fairly large-ish scale, where it wasn't just a couple of uniforms. It was a good manufacturing batch that was produced. But this isn't, unique to World War II. This was done, way earlier. They looked at replacing the leather M1916 holster with a canvas one. It looks really, really similar in some aspects. And I think it was only about 30 or... No, I think it was 50. It was 50 that they trialled. And they literally says, trial this until destruction. And there's almost none left. I know of one that's being sold, and I keep being tempted to buy it, but I just can't justify the price ticket for a single holster. But it'd be very nice to own. You also see these being sold on eBay as cheap reproduction things, and they're always called something like paratrooper webbing holster or some utter shit like that. It's even the wrong war. So this testing of items in the field is not new at all.
See how this myth became so prevalent. Those US camo uniforms do kind of resemble some of the German camouflage patterns, but that just had nothing to do with why they stopped using them during the war. This next myth is one that could apply to a lot of other conflicts as well, but let's cover how it relates to World War II. Myth number 4, the airborne and other elite army units did all the heavy lifting.
No, not the airborne. Only E Company 506, they did everything. They won the war single-handed. Did you not know? Did you not watch Band of Brothers?
The Airborne, the Rangers, the 1st Special Service Force, clearly these are the elite troops that won the war by themselves. Forget about the other 99% of the US Army. Now, I won't pretend not to understand why so much focus is put on these specialized World War II units, even though they made up such a small percentage of the fighting force. They were unique. They're super interesting. Of course, a unit like the 101st Airborne Division, who were specially trained to jump out of planes, used custom-made gear and equipment, and took part in some of the war's most famous battles, is going to stand out from the Army's 68 Standard Infantry Divisions. Those Standard Infantry Divisions can all start to blend together in some people's mind, but they were the backbone of the US Army. From the Philippines to Sicily to the Hurtgen Forest, conventional US GIs were face-to-face with the enemy day in and day out, mounting attacks, repelling enemy assaults, and just holding the line. The specialized units...
Yeah, but when you want to retell a story in the war, like, you can go to Hollywood for this. You don't look for what's average. Average is, distinctly average. You go for what's the most exciting, who's the coolest, who has the best kit, who has the best weapons, who has the best stories, who won the best medals. And again, when it comes to collecting, you tend to find more people go towards, Rangers, Airborne, Marines. You don't go, oh, I collect 6 infantry. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of guys who do collect certain divisions, but the majority, they go for those elite units. So yeah, I can see why, and if you're going to tell a story, you tend to pick the elite ones over the other ones. Yeah, I can see it. I'm not saying it's right.
I mentioned were often reserved and sent out on specific missions, and because of that, they get a lot more attention than the regular GIs who were out living on the line. The airborne, for example, made up around 18% of the US troops who invaded occupied France on D-Day, and as more and more soldiers poured into the beaches in the following days, that percentage dropped significantly. Those paratroopers had a very important and dangerous job, but that job wasn't to go win the war by themselves or something. I think in some people's mind, the airborne has started to outshine the rest of the army troops who took part in that battle. The airborne kicked open the door to France so the rest of the army could pour in and get in the fight. It's a similar story with the Army Rangers. They also had very crucial and dangerous missions on D-Day, and they fought bravely, suffering many casualties in the process. The Rangers were an even smaller force, though, making up roughly 1% of the US Army troops who landed on D-Day. Similar to what we covered with the Marines, the inflated perception of these units is in large part due to pop culture overexposure. In addition to just being unique, these units and the missions they took part in often lend themselves perfectly to creating narratives for books, movies, and video games.
There we go. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, go to Hollywood.
A relatively small, specialized group taking on a dangerous, high-risk mission that can be resolved fairly quickly is like the perfect narrative formula. Making an interesting movie about a run-of-the-mill infantry division that's slogging it out on the front lines for months on end can be a bit more difficult. But those divisions are the ones who are out there getting the job done. I used the common examples of the Airborne and the Rangers, and it's no coincidence that Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, two of the most popular depictions of World War II ever created, focus on those units. Don't get me wrong, those are some of my all-time favorites, but they definitely elevated those units over some others in many people's minds.
Yeah, E Company 506 won the war single-handed. Everybody knows this.
Maybe someday I'll make a super accurate World War II movie about some unassuming kid who gets drafted into a unit you've never heard of and then becomes like a typist or something like that. That was
I laugh, but for the percentage of guys in the army, their war was, you know, much more mundane than everything you see in all these, you know, Hollywood blockbusters. Yeah, if you want a realistic war, you know, yeah. I think actually, as much as I laugh, it would be a good thing to watch, and go through all the boring things like, you know, issuing the kit and a bit more on basic training where they're not, you know, shooting live bullets over their head and crawling through ditches full of pig's blood and barbed wire. Yeah, let's see all the mundane things, because actually for a lot of us reenactors, it'd actually be very interesting.
Very logistically important, but also super boring. Something tells me that probably would not sell too many.
I love it. Keyboard warrior, yes. Oh, how many of those do we know?
Tickets, but hey, who knows? Personally, I don't see any issue depicting these specialized units because they are very interesting and they deserve all the credit they get. Let's just remember to give the rest of the army who did the brunt of the fighting the credit they deserve as well. Conventional troops may not have always had the spotlight on them, but at the end of the day, the bravery and heroism exhibited by these GIs and conventional troops from other nations is what secured victory for the Allies. Let's move on to the final myth for today, and I'm always surprised at how popular this one is. Myth number 5. Women could not serve in the US Army during World War II.
See, that surprises me. I mean, I think you have to get your head around what they mean by serve. If they mean fight, like physically fight and kill the enemy, then yeah, they couldn't. But serve, absolutely. I mean, you've got several different branches, you know. You got the WACs, and then you've got the WACs, you've got the Navy. Yeah, you've got so many different branches in the US military of solely women.
A lot of people are familiar with Rosie the Riveter and the many US women who work tirelessly in factories to support our troops overseas, but I've found that far fewer people realize that some of those troops overseas were also women. That's right, women served in every branch of the US military during World War II, with over 350,000 women joining the military before the end of the war. These women didn't serve in combat roles, but they did fill
Yeah.
many crucial logistical and support jobs.
Absolutely.
Another version of this myth I hear is that women could only serve as nurses during the war, and while that is one of the many important jobs that they filled, that isn't even close to the only one. I know this video is about army myths, but why don't we quickly go through the important jobs that women filled in each branch?
Yeah,
the US
absolutely.
Coast Guard had the SPARS, which stands for Semper Paratus Always Ready. Women in the SPARS often served as photographers, cooks, pharmacy assistants, and drivers, among other jobs. The Navy had the Navy Nurse Corps and the WAVES, which stands for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Hats off to whoever came up with that catchy name.
Good.
WAVES were often tasked with clerical work, storekeeping, weather forecasting, navigation, hospital work, engineering, and more. Next is the Marine Corps, who had the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, or MCWR. I guess they didn't get the memo about catchy abbreviations. They often filled clerical roles as well as trade and mechanical roles, such as aircraft maintenance, among other things. The Army Air Forces had the WASPs, or the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. These pilots often ferried aircraft, towed targets for gunnery training, and served as instrument instructors. And finally, the Army had the Army Nurse Corps and the WAC, for Women's Army Corps. WACs filled a wide variety of roles like switchboard operators, mechanics, postal clerks, drivers, typists, and medical personnel, just to name a few. These jobs were not combat roles, but many of them were still very dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hundreds of women lost their lives while serving in World War II, some from accidents like plane crashes, while others were killed by enemy fire due to their close proximity to the front line. Additionally, more than 80 nurses were taken prisoner by the enemy during the war. 3 years after the war, in 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was signed into law. This act formally allowed women to enlist as full permanent members in all branches of the military. I think sometimes people hear that date and assume that before that was passed, women couldn't serve in the military or could only serve as nurses, not realizing the many women who served in auxiliary and reserve roles during World War II. So if you ever hear someone saying that US women couldn't serve in the military during World War II, make sure to set them straight and be sure to hit them with some of those fun acronyms while you're at it. Hopefully those explanations help to dispel some of those myths, although I have a feeling that some of those will end up following me forever. Please leave a comment down below and let me know which of those myths you had heard before, and also let me know some of the other myths you've heard that didn't make it in this video. I hate to break it to you guys, but now that you know the truth behind all those myths, you're officially a history nerd, so you might as well just accept it and subscribe to World War Wisdom, because that's where all of us history nerds hang out. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Remember to hype up the Sherman tank when you can, because it gets a little self-conscious, and I'll see you in the next one. Please.
Right, so, yeah, no, I do really like his videos. He is called World War Wisdom. Make sure, go, follow. Oh, why can't I like it? Oh, obviously Facebook's having a moment. Oh, great. There we go. I am subscribed, good. Yeah, no, his videos are all very good. I've not found one that I've gone at yet. I'm sure there'll be a moment. You know how fussy and pedantic I can be. No, stupid adverts playing. Right, okay. Thanks to me for that link. I will do another in a second. Apologies for that was a bit of a long one. Right, laters.